Exactly. Hello, and thank you for everyone for joining today. I hope you're all staying safe and well during these times, and welcome to our webinar, Planning for Construction's Recovery Post-Covid-19. My name is Niamh Kearney. I am a construction market executive based in Enterprise Ireland's London office. And for those of you that are joining us today that are not familiar with Enterprise Ireland, it is the Irish government organisation responsible for the development and growth of Irish enterprises in world markets. London is one of our 40 offices worldwide, and Enterprise Ireland supports some of the most innovative Irish companies in recent years, and we've seen a focus on specific market requirements around modern methods of construction, digital and low carbon technologies. I am delighted to introduce today's guest speaker, Simon Rawlinson, Head of Strategic Research and Insights for Arcadis UK and Ireland, and on the board of the Construction Leadership Council. Just over a week ago, on the 1st of June 2020, the Construction Leadership Council's COVID task force laid out its proposals to secure the future of construction businesses nationwide while setting the industry on a sustainable path towards recovery. Simon is here today to discuss the road to recovery and share his insights. A recorded version of this webinar will be available online under the UK Market Opportunity page of globalambition.ie, or alternatively, feel free to drop myself an email. My email will be available on the last slide of this presentation. So for those of you just now, welcome, thank you, and I will pass you on to Simon Rawlinson.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Niamh, and thank you everybody for taking the time out of your very busy days to learn a little bit about the UK construction sector and what we're doing to navigate the recovery. So what I'm planning on talking about today is, firstly, I'm going to be giving a very brief overview of the UK construction markets for those who might not be familiar with some of the detail and particularly the impacts of COVID over the last couple of months. Then again, an equally pretty rapid gallop through what the CLC is and what we've been doing during COVID, bit of focus on the recovery plan. And then I was also asked to just provide a little bit of insight into some of the differences between the site operating procedures in the UK and Ireland. And I think that would probably be quite helpful to understand, perhaps, if people want to enter the different markets. But without further ado, I think it's probably just worthwhile sort of getting a sense of what UK construction looks like. The first thing I think it's really important to recognise, it's a really big market. And now what you see there, you've got a bit of a graph there, you'll see that compared to some European markets, Ireland particularly, housing is actually a relatively small side, and then there's a quite big infrastructure segment and a huge RM&I element. And that, of course, some of that is people doing up their houses, but a lot of that is again around infrastructure and the public sector. And one thing I would flag up there, in common with probably every European market, is there is a huge sort of latent retrofit opportunity around the route to net zero carbon. And that's barely started in the UK. It's going to be kicked off by about 9–10 billion worth of investment over the next 3 or 4 years. So there's something going on there. So just a little bit of some data around giving a sense of things. That's 180 billion. Typically, when things are going right, it grows at about 3 to 4%. And you'll see things are going to be a little bit different this year, but I'll leave that for the moment. And then in terms of, actually, it's again, like pretty much every European construction sector, it's very fragmented. So very few of the organisations, 2% out of the 180 or so thousand enterprises in the sector, employ over 250 people. 25 people, 2.3 million employees. Probably another million in associated industries, manufacturing, consulting, such like. And finally, this really interesting statistic around the level of self-employment. So very high penetration of self-employment. And that, of course, creates a degree of what you might describe as insecurity for the workforce during issues such as the COVID pandemic and what the outcome of that might be. So just seeing where we are in terms of where we are in the cycle, and this isn't construction specific data, but I thought it'd be really useful in terms of just illustrating what's happening. So Here we have some of the PMI indicators. You might be familiar that there's Irish ones of these as well. And you'll see that the UK and the Eurozone went very deep into close down. This is a sentiment measure. It's not a measure of output, so it's not suggesting that output fell by 40%, but very much a dramatic shutdown. And that is replicated as much in construction as it was in services and in manufacturing, certainly from a sentiment perspective. That's on the left side. On the right-hand side, there's a quite interesting indicator about almost what you might describe as the limits to recovery. So these guys, PMI, IHS Market, have come up with this idea of a containment index. And I'm sure you'll have heard lots of things about, so the UK is trying to sort of get out of containment as quickly as possible. We're apparently opening zoos next Monday as a next step in terms of getting out. But there's always going to be that sort of legacy bit that you can't open up, whether that's due to social distancing and such like. So that's going to be a constraint, and that will be as much a constraint on construction and productivity as it is on other sectors of the economy. In terms of trying to think about what's actually going to happen, it's really difficult. I actually sit on the Construction Products Association panel, so I've been involved in some of these discussions, and I have to say I'm pleased I wasn't the poor person who had to sort of develop this kind of scenario. But the headline there is that there's an expectation in 2020 that output on what you might describe as the most likely scenario could fall by 25%. Now, that is, for the UK at least, that's an enormous number. I think the maximum contraction we saw year on year in the great financial crisis was maybe something like 8%. And now, I know that certain construction markets and Ireland saw very, very deep contractions that might be comparable, but where you've got a market the size of 160 billion, we're talking there a loss of potentially 40 billion out of output, which is a lot of people's jobs, a lot of materials and what have you. Just picking up a couple of things there. Private housing, particularly vulnerable because, of course, you've got the house builders concerned about their ability to sell product. Similarly, the commercial sector expected that's the kind of sector where people will put projects on hold. Now, in terms of what that output forecast means, of course, quite a lot of it has already happened because we had, even though we kept sites open for the entire period, a lot did shut down. We've also got long-term impacts around productivity. So in terms of that's going to be a lag or a drag on output over the certainly the next 9 months. And then there's this issue about the workload that's coming through. And I've recently undertaken a survey within my business, and so 50% of the respondents were suggesting that procurement was being delayed, not being stopped, but things were slowing down a little bit. And of course, that's going to be a massive concern to anybody in the sector. Now, there's a few little data points that I've just got on the side there. I don't sort of plan to sort of go through many of them in detail, but that one around actually in terms of even in 1.5 weeks in March with the lockdown, output fell in construction by 6%, and I think that just articulates just how significantly things turned around very quickly, and also the depth of the shutdown. Highlighted, for example, by the Federation of Master Builders, and that 91% of projects stopped by that sample that they were describing. So some pretty dramatic stuff going on in the sector. Now, in terms of thinking then about sort of, if we take that and then if we think about the context of the CLC. So this is a bit of a recap of what we are, what we do. First, before I get into the detail, we were established in 2012. This was at the same time when government set some very challenging targets around cost reduction, carbon reduction, programme improvement, 33% for cost, 50% for programme and carbon. And the CLC was originally set up as quite a pan-industry body, quite a complicated body to sort of move this agenda forward. We were reformed and I joined in 2015 as a very much slimmed down body. And we set out to simplify the agenda, and particularly to focus on an agenda driven by innovation, focused primarily on digital technologies, on manufacturing technologies, and focus on the performance of assets, the kind of agenda that Enterprise Ireland is very sort of committed to. So the purpose that we've got is firstly to deliver what's called the sector deal. So that was signed off in 2018, and that gave us 170 million pounds of investment, backed up by a further 230 million from the sector. So that's precisely 400 million than we've ever had before to sort of invest in the sectors of efficiency future. So we've been driving a lot of programs around that. We've been bringing industry to work together to deliver the strategy goals that I described. And then if we get key initiatives, you think about building safety after the Grenfell disaster, we've had quite a significant role in that as well. And it's mainly around convening lots of different bodies rather than trying to do it all ourselves. So, and I'm not going to go through this, but you can imagine we've got a galaxy of different bodies that we work with, client bodies, public sector, various some innovation bodies and such like. And that all starts to bring together and create some momentum. And I have to say that prior to COVID, things were moving along pretty well, and we had certain agendas, so for example, skills were making great progress. But within industry as fragmented as any construction industry, it was really hard to sort of create profile and make a difference. And what I have to say is that with COVID, we suddenly found the opportunity to bring the whole industry together, galvanize the industry, which again has lots of different representative bodies, into a task group. And a week before the lockdown started, we had an operational group, so we'd already anticipated that there was going to be a problem. We actually had our site operating procedures in place a day before lockdown, so we were ready for those. We were ready for some issues around the ambiguity about whether construction should start or not. And this group has now met, I think it's 52 times in the sort of 10 weeks that we've been locked down. Huge amount of progress, driving an agenda across a wide range of issues. All of the work we've done being made available. And if I just sort of highlight some of the things that we've done, you may be familiar with the site operating procedures. They were some of the first. That made it probably particularly difficult because we were having to negotiate some sort of quite what you might describe as nuanced relationships, say, between main contractors, clients, and specialist contractors. A lot of guidance for our supply chain around how some of the job retention schemes operate, and quite a lot of lobbying around how that might be adjusted over the period. I've been leading some work around productivity measurement, so that again, clients, consultants, contractors have a better handle on actually what's happening across the industry rather than just individual projects. So we've got a sense of whether people are managing things well or not so well. And then a lot of lobbying as well. It may not have emerged as an issue in Ireland yet, but we've got some big constraints around professional indemnity and trade credit insurance that actually threatened to potentially close down some projects. So some quite good progress on that. And then, of course, we've kept very close to advising our government partners in terms of helping them understand what the impact of COVID has been on the sector, what they should be doing, supporting the development of the recovery plan as well. So some really, I think, some stuff which, on reflection, in a while's time, I think people will really think that we did make a difference. Now, in terms of just then moving on to the recovery plan, and just before I sort of go on to that, if anybody's got any questions, I'm very happy to take them. Alternatively, we can just sort of keep moving on, but I don't know if there's a facility for people to put a hand up or whether Name's going to sort of bring the questions up. But if you do want to ask something, don't hesitate to stop. So the recovery plan, and as I said, this was launched a week and a half ago. It's got quite a lot of support from the relevant government departments, and that is effectively, it's our housing department, the MHCLG, our business department, which sponsors construction, and then the various bodies that have an interest in particularly the delivery of social and economic infrastructure. So we've corralled a lot of people behind it. It's not at the moment backed up by an additional spending commitment, so that's something which is to come, and obviously we'll wait anxiously around that, and I don't have any particular crystal ball, but there's a lot of very strong mood music that construction is seen as being a key part of the recovery. And if I can just sort of then give a bit of an overview about the plan, what it intends to do. The first thing is it positions construction absolutely at the centre of the recovery of the wider UK economy. And there are a number of reasons for that, I think, and again, I'm sure lots of people on the call will be familiar with the fact that construction delivers lots of well-paid jobs right across the country in sort of almost every region, and that they tend to sort of the spend tends to be very localized. So if you want to put money into the local economy, spending on construction is quite a good way of doing it. It also, the money moves around pretty quickly, so you don't necessarily have to do a huge amount of upfront investment to get things going in the same way that you might if you were commissioning a new factory or something like that. So definitely being seen as being as a key part of that recovery. Now, the strategy aims, they're born partly on the experience of what's happened over the last couple of months. So the first one, this was quite interesting and ambitious one around increasing the level of activity across the entire ecosystem. So you've got to bring all parts together. Going back to that pie chart, there's no point just saying we will focus on infrastructure and we will leave house building and RMI behind, partly because those sectors employ a huge number of people, but also because the materials supply chain, the ecosystem of builders merchants and such like, they won't survive unless all parts of the economy are thriving. So we have to sort of like keep all of them going. And that makes it particularly challenging to organize this and to get our sponsors to understand the complexity. The second one then is to recognize that we're in a new normal, so that we're not likely to go back to being able to build as we did, let's say in January, in the near future. So you have to adapt to working around site operating procedures. You need to sort of initially direct the innovation work that we're doing, not to what you'd like to say, oh, this is what we'd like to be doing in 2 or 3 years' time. It's saying, what can we solve now that will make it possible for work in proximity to be done in a safer way, or to reduce the amount of labour required on site at this moment on current projects. So that's created a really strong focus for our R&D programme to say possibly go away from the sort of like the what you might describe as the horizon seeking stuff, or to get really pragmatic. And then the final bit is this element about thinking about, actually we need to shape the industry to deliver not just some what you might describe as the infrastructure which we already know about, but the strategic priorities around net zero carbon, around safe building, enhanced capabilities and such like. So there's a really strong what you might describe as long view that goes through the entire recovery plan, which has benefited from the work that we've been doing here since 2015. And I suspect that there are quite a lot of lessons that could be applied from this recovery plan to lots of other construction markets in terms of how you create sort of like a central core around it. And I have to say, if the CLC hadn't been looking at this for the last 2-3 years, if we hadn't had the sector deal in place, it would be much harder to get a coherent response together. Now, I'm going to talk about the 3 phases in a little bit more detail in a moment, so I'll skip over those and I'll just focus on the outcomes. And I think you look at these and you think, actually, this probably makes this a more interesting and attractive market to be thinking about operating within and thinking about what post-Brexit operations might look like, given that we have this travel zone and everything. There's quite a lot of potential here. So firstly, I think there's the expectation that actually we can shift up a gear in terms of productivity, in terms of capability and profitability. And that's always been at the heart of what we've been aiming to do, but it's notoriously difficult to do. So we do think that we might be able to take advantage of that through the concentration that COVID has given us. The second one, really important around better value. That's not just price value, cost value, certainly not cheapest. It's that sense of value defined by social value, by economic value, by manufacturing capital and what have you. So real sort of perspective of 5 capitals thinking. And that stretches to the development of a procurement framework, a value framework, which will enable us to, say, for example, weight projects in accordance with the client's sort of priorities with respect to, say, for example, sustainability, social value, all of those elements. So there's a lot of deep thinking going on here. Better performing infrastructure, of course, that's what you'd expect from a successful sector. And then finally, this one around competition in global markets. So it's building skills in, let's say, for example, component-based construction delivery, rather than necessarily a new manufacturing resource base in the UK, but the sense of this is the best way to deliver projects effectively, in the same way that the UK has been exporting expertise in BIM for the past 10 years. And of course, with all of these things, if we just kept on going as we would, not only would we be going into recession in any case, but I think we also risk sort of the long-term costs of reduced productivity. So this is the plan. Now this is the summary page. If you have a look at the document, which is available via the CLC website, you'll see that each one of these 9 phases is backed up by quite a detailed plan, which has got owners, which has got outcomes. But if we just summarize this as being, firstly, it's 3 stages, each stage having 3 component parts. It's delivered over 12 months. The reinvent phase in practice started probably 1 to 2 years ago. And actually what we're doing is we're accelerating work that's being done. The restart piece is all about getting as much construction done as is possible, consistent with safe working, but also to sort of minimize what you might describe as the friction associated with the loss of people through unemployment, and also the friction that might result from contractual disputes. So there's a really big push on encouraging both the public and private sector to apply what you might describe as fairly collaborative approaches to the way in which contract provisions are applied. And those recommendations are made with a recognition that will create some quite difficult sort of compromises for people who might actually have quite strong contractual positions. Slightly different to the approach adopted in the SOP in Ireland, where there's a quite strong encouragement for effectively the clients to build in the costs of all of this straight into the program and into the budgets from the start. So we're not dictating how that might be done, but this very clearly is what you might describe as a sort of like a collaborative message sent out there in terms of how people should work together. In terms of reset, a lot of reset is about bringing forward as quickly as possible work that is in the pipeline. So the UK is effectively recalibrating its public and private sector infrastructure pipeline as we speak. That will probably be made available in a couple of weeks, so people will be able to see what's been brought forward. And I think the important bit there is that is actually bringing forward as much work as possibly can be within this current financial year. So it's accelerating spend, which is a great way of helping, at least in the short term, both designers and contractors. There's some, as I've talked about already, work about applying existing R&D programs to improve productivity on existing projects as well as new, and then a whole lot of training investments around how we will effectively work more efficiently in a more aligned way, in a more collaborative way. And again, there's a whole lot of detail around the kind of work that has been developed by lots of different parties across different sectors to back that up. A reinvent, as I say, it's something that's been going on for a while. Probably the most important bit of that is this idea of a transformation of the industry, and the work of what's known as the Construction Innovation Hub in the UK, established again in 2018 as part of the sector deal, is very important in that. And there's some really quite clever innovation that's been backed by best part of 70 million of funding, R&D funding, is going to start sort of coming into fruition and scaling up through this program. Lots of work around value. And again, I've already mentioned the stuff around the procurement work that's been done, which is to encourage more of a focus on whole life performance, and to bring that to fruition, particularly focused on the infrastructure sector. There's a desire to build up a much stronger sort of partnership approach, wider use of alliances, deep integration within supply chains and such like. And again, that is building on a trend that has been around for quite a while. So that's the recovery plan in a nutshell. There's a lot more detail available online if you are interested. And I think it is really almost a primer in how the sector was going to change anyway. So I would say if COVID hadn't happened, then most of the things that are detailed in that plan, other than what you might describe as the immediate sort of like recovery elements, were the things that we would have need to have done anyway to make sure that we're productive. So it really is a great example of not wasting in this case, a not very good crisis at all. So the kind of outputs that are expected, clearly the most obvious one is that if government spends or private sector spend money on construction investment, they want the outcomes, and increasingly those outcomes are defined as social outcomes. If you think about the current government's focus on levelling up, so clearly this will be our contribution will be very much part of that levelling up agenda. There's a huge focus on reducing carbon emissions. And it's fair to say that if you looked as an outsider at the documentation describing what the public sector planned to do about eliminating carbon emissions from the existing or new building stock, you'd be scratching your head a little bit and thinking, well, there's not a lot of ambition there. And I think so. I think this is almost like a trigger to get the momentum going. There's some good work by organisations like the Green Construction Board, and they've got a really excellent sort of decarbonisation roadmap for new build and work at retrofit. So there's a lot of expertise around. There's a lot of stuff around the social agenda, particularly driven by safer housing. So that's a unique, perhaps, issue that the UK is having to deal with. But what sits behind that in terms of skills, transparency, proper allocation of risk and responsibility and such like, I think is probably much more universally applicable. And then, as I said before, there's a big role, a very big role in the levelling up agenda and increasing the prosperity across the UK. And the final ones I'll just wrap up together, that you cannot separate the creation of innovation culture from business models that enable people to work together to support that innovation, and the skills and diversity of capability that's needed to be able to create it in the first place and deliver it. So those three are really closely intertwined, and that, I think, actually then informs some of the thinking about how this is going to be organised and delivered, because I suspect you probably got the impression this looks a bit complicated. It's not the kind of stuff that can be delivered by a part-time body in sort of time snatched from managing our own organisations and our response to the crisis. So in terms of the way in which the delivery plan is, what we're seeing here is that we see that firstly, that if you've got that plan, restart, reset, and reinvent, then there are going to be different flavours of it for different parts of the construction sector. So again, if we went back to that pie chart right at the start, you recognise that housing is a really big chunk, about 25%. Domestic RMI, about 40%. Infrastructure is about 15, something like that. So this is targeting big chunks, and you can get quite a lot of resource from a range of different representative bodies. So that might be, for example, representative consultant bodies, some kind of organisation that I work through in Arcadis. It might be contractors and their subcontractors, and indeed it might be product manufacturers as well. So there's a lot of resource, and a lot of this sits in organisations that have been doing lots of great work, but have been doing it in a slightly uncoordinated way. So it's a sort of classic situation with lots of people going genuinely in the same direction but dissipating their energy. So what we have done is we've adapted the CLC structure to a matrix, the kind of thing you'd see perhaps in a sort of consulting organisation, where on the horizontals represent those kind of industry strands. So there you can see housing, you can see some domestic RMI, and then you've got what you can almost describe as the national priorities that the CLC has either been responsible for over the past 4 or 5 years, or alternatively that we're starting to sort of put the wick up on. So building safety, for example, is something that has been growing in importance since the Hackett review was originally published, and then the MHCLG proposals. Something like business models has been a sort of continuous area of focus for quite a while. So it's sort of a bit of a variety there. And so you've got potentially 2 sort of like big work streams. You might have an infrastructure group who have to deliver their commitments under the recovery plan. You've got the net zero team. They have to deliver a very significant reduction in carbon emissions associated with both construction and operation of buildings. And then at some point they'll intersect. So you've almost got 3 sort of fields of play by which programs are operated. And the plan is to sort of effectively manage this as a program. As anybody familiar with delivering large sort of portfolios of work, it's exactly as we would deliver a capital program using a sort of PMO kind of structure. That's still a bit of work in progress in terms of how we're going to do it, but the ambition is there, and clearly there's a lot of government alignment in thinking and such like. So that pretty much covers the recovery plan. So I'm just going to sort of finish off with a finale, which won't take very long, around thinking about site operating plans. And then if anybody's got any questions, so site operating procedures, pardon me, if anybody's got any questions, we can wrap up on that. And the first thing is of course, I think on a face-to-face comparison, it has to be said that the version from the Construction Industry Federation of Ireland is much more photogenic. And I think it possibly reflects the fact that the version that we've got on, we're actually now on version 4, but this was put together at an absolute sort of hurricane speed, and actually in some ways it feels appropriate that we don't move on fundamentally from what was developed early in March, because everybody's got used to it. It would almost be a folly now to sort of like completely reformat and restructure the procedures, when all it would mean that everybody would have to refamiliarize themselves. So to some extent we're a victim of our own success in being so responsive and so quick. but I have to put my hat up to the Construction Industry Federation, because it's a really, really very well put together document. And there are some, I think, some what you could describe as some characteristics. I've talked about the element of the UK having to do things incredibly quickly. I think it's also fair to say that the UK has relied rather more on the unstated operation of the existing HSE framework, or existing CDM regulations and such like that people will continue to act to those. And I think what strikes me about the Irish guidance is that it's much more explicit, let's say, for example, around the role of the client, or the creation of new roles, such as the compliance officer. So I've highlighted there, and I don't intend to go through them because you'll understand these things far better than I will. Some of the things that I think for Ireland, where I think you've gone into more detail, and I think you've done some really interesting work. I think the guidance for suspect cases, for example, in the first aid guidance is really, really interesting, and I'll be taking that back to CLC. But there's a lot of stuff that is common as well. And just the two that I'm going to pick up, and I think these are ones that are going to run and run. And I think the first one is the guidance around masks, and how that is managed in terms of between clients, contractors and operatives, because it seems to be very little evidence that masks will actually protect people, but they clearly give people confidence that they are going to be safer in terms of working with them. But at the same time, the idea of adding guidance into documents that actually effectively contradicts our sort of public health bodies' guidance seems to be really inappropriate. So there's a real challenge that anybody involved in putting this guidance together has to resolve in dealing with those things, because they are truly a rock and a hard place. And the second one, I think, is this area around close working arrangements. Now, in our fourth iteration, we did clarify some of the guidance around that, because previously we had probably more detail than we might otherwise have had, some time periods when it was safe to work in close proximity. That's been lifted out because we felt it was probably giving a bit of sort of like maybe more security than was perhaps appropriate. But clearly, in terms of the debates about is it 2 meters, 1.5 meters, 1 meter, is going to be raging for the rest of the year, and that's going to affect everybody at operative level and supervisory level who's operating in those workplaces. And I think we just have to be really sensitive to those debates and how those things have worked out over the period of time. Now, I'm aware that I'm sort of probably sort of moving into the back end of the seminar, so I'm going to sort of stop at that point. I think we've got a final nice little holding slide. I'm going to go on to the next one, actually. But if there's any questions anybody's got, I'll be delighted to take them on. I don't have to race off at this moment, so I'm going to hand over to you, Naim, for the finals of comparing.
Thanks very much. We actually do have a few questions through.
Great.
So the first one, the minimus disruption due to contractual disputes section mentions, let me see, sorry, just clicked out of it. Sorry, here we go. The minimus distribution due to contractual disputes sections mentions adjudication. Did Construction Leadership Council consider actively promoting mediation, for example, or other forms of ADR like early neutral evaluation?
So that's a really interesting question. So I think the first observation I'll make is that particularly in the public sector, clients have been really active in providing early support. So we had a procurement note 0220, which was encouraging clients to provide support, early payments and such like where they should. I think from a point of various means of dispute resolution, I think that's absolutely right, because I think at the heart of COVID it's what the clause written down actually sort of says. It's more what the intention of the parties might be, and the cold economic reality of what will be the implications if the contract is applied as it's written. So I think those sort of kind of mediation approaches are really important, but they're really important from both sides, because I think it's important that the supply chain understands the constraints that are affecting the clients, as well as the clients understanding the clearly very difficult economic situation that the supply chain is as well. So it's getting that balance. It's really difficult. I'm not hearing you there. Are you able to?
Yeah, sorry. The retail construction sector has been in a decline for a while before COVID. Now commercial sector has been predicted to decline also. Do we think this will be a long-term problem post COVID-19 and due to the new normal of people working from home, or will this be something that will recover quite fast past COVID-19?
I wish I had that. I wish I had that crystal ball, because if I did, I would be deciding whether to invest in shares in property companies. What I do think is that whether retail, for example, recovers to where it was, say, 24 months ago, not 2 months ago, there's going to be a massive piece of work around repurposing lots of assets, be they shopping malls, possibly offices that maybe are no longer or are surplus to requirements, and whether they're repurposed for housing or for new kinds of leisure or sort of communal requirements. I don't know what they'll be, but the idea that they will sit around and not be used, I think is difficult to consider that might be the case. But the kind of innovation that will be needed to fund and deliver those kind of repositionings, when clearly the revenue streams aren't going to be as strong as they would have been in their original use, it's going to be a real, I think, sort of, it'll ask people to be really ingenious and really innovative about how we make these things happen. But they will make places better. And I think that is a really important contribution that construction and asset owners can make to the post-COVID recovery.
Brilliant. And if we have time for one more, I've got another one in here. What will the second phase of Restart and Reset translate into for Irish companies looking at the export into the UK? Will support local sentiment Act be a significant barrier post-COVID?
I think if the reset works as well as we would like it to, combined with quite an ambition, particularly in the public sector, to increase the volume of work, say for example on roads, school and rail, then I think there will be potential opportunities for the organisations in the Irish supply chain, many of course who are already very active in the UK market. I think what it will, to be successful, I think it will require people to be very attuned to the kind of responses, the kind of different products, the innovative approaches that these public sector clients are looking for. And I think so. I think the risk would be to apply what you might describe as not necessarily old thinking, but maybe even the new thinking, but maybe not asking precisely the question that the government client in the UK is asking for. So I think it's just that sense of being really attuned to the innovation agenda in the UK and taking advantage of that, and the great expertise that sits within the Irish construction industry.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for coming today, and thanks everyone who listened today. I think we'll finish up on that last one.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Okay, goodbye.